Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I've got Matt Nelson with me, the chapter president of CSA West Michigan, and we are going to discuss the principles of private cloud.
Sounds exciting.
It should be very exciting. Let's dig in.
Episode 2 of our technical presentation.
Episode 2, yes.
We haven't really come up with a good name yet, though. So if
No,
anyone out there wants to help us come up with a name for these, we'd be grateful.
Please do. All right, so the agenda today, we've got 8 principles here we came up with as you consider private cloud for your organization and how you want to go about implementing or using that, and if it's even right for your organization. So we want to talk about private cloud, not private, or the private cloud versus public cloud. Effective governance, your service provider, you're going to be a service provider, prioritized business, and so on. So Matt, let's go right in. Let's jump to the next slide, and then we'll cover the rest of this.
All right.
So this is where we want to talk about the private cloud not being private. If you do a private cloud, you might be hosting that out to another service provider for the data center, and they'll manage some of the infrastructure for you. So it's not private in the sense that you are probably going to be relying on another organization to at least put the infrastructure in place for you to use exclusively for yourself, or maybe you're going to bring it on site, but you still may have some managed services. So you need to really define what private cloud means to you in your organization, how you want to use it, how you want to add this to your toolkit of services for your business to be able to meet whatever requirements they have and deliver their products and services. The next thing you're going to want to think about is identifying your boundaries. In your private cloud, you need to think about, do I want to keep this only internal and keep it truly private to our organization? Or do we want to open this up and have API connections and third-party integrations? Put your HR portals in there. It can be less expensive, but you really need to understand what you're going to connect to and what services you're going to provide as you define your private cloud.
And you probably want to future-proof some of those conversations as you're identifying those boundaries too, because while you may think to originally start as something completely internal, chances are as more and more of your applications are moving to cloud-based, that eventually you will probably have to open this up to some external connections.
Right, exactly. And in the deployment models, private, public, hybrid, whatever you're looking at, they all contain the same elements. So private cloud is just public cloud that you own top to bottom, so to speak. So yeah, you really got to think about that. And that leads us into determining your support model. As you manage your own infrastructure and services to provide a cloud with resiliency and elasticity and all those great qualities of cloud, you may end up with higher overhead. You're going to have to manage it, or if you contract it out, you're going to need to make sure that whatever hosting provider you're using for your infrastructure on your virtual cloud is going to align with how you do business. So you may not have all the internal resources you need to support it, and you'll want to consider what you may have to add or what you may have to change to make your private cloud successful.
And I think that leads us very well into this third piece of truly understanding the business value, of understanding, what benefits you're getting out of having a private cloud versus what are potentially some higher costs that could be associated with having a private cloud.
Absolutely. You may look at if you want to host your private cloud out into another data center. There are many reasons to do so. Regulatory might become more easier if you're SOC 2 compliant. Then they can handle some of that for you, and it offloads some of that. And then with shared responsibility, you could really delegate out some of the services to that provider to do like patch management and things to offload some of that. So there's a lot of things here that you could do to help, and then really understanding, like Matt said, what your business wants to deliver and how they would make the best use of private cloud. Yep. So now that we've discussed all that, we should talk about how to get started. So you've defined your private cloud. Awesome. You know what it means to your organization. You know how you have, or at least you have an idea of how your business wants to leverage the functionality and features of a cloud. So now you need to talk about data governance. You're going to be putting data into this private cloud, and what is the right data? You can very easily allow the business to spin up data stores. They can spin up data swamps or lakes or whatever you want to call them. It's easy to leak that data out if you don't have governance. And you may not have all the other protections you normally would. There's not always full validation on APIs and things when you're making callouts to ensure that it's the right data moving through there. So you got to be really mindful about the governance you put in. And I think a trap that's easy to fall into is that IT starts to drive some of this conversation on how to best protect the organization from making mistakes. But that's really, from my perspective, not an IT responsibility. The business needs to be responsible for their data. They need to understand and monitor the types of data that they're using. They have to understand what they're compliant to and what their regulatory obligations are. And then they can go to IT and just request a service delivery. And that's, you're delivering private cloud just like a public cloud provider would. You're providing a service. So you need to be able to accommodate, like when they come to you and say, I've got this data and it's protected health information. Okay, cool. I've got a bucket. You can put that in. Here you go. Here's your service. Knock yourself out. And it has all the controls built around it that they would need. There's also going to be, to the point of the right data. Is it the right data? You've got multiple instances. You're pulling data from different sources, allowing the business to spin up their own database servers in your private cloud. They could be pulling data from a SharePoint site when they really probably should be pulling it from this other application. And where you could end up is making business decisions on the wrong data. It may look like the right data, but it was through another source that didn't have the right data. So that's something you really want to take into account as you're looking at this.
Yeah, and I think the data governance conversation to me is something that can be looked at both from an on-prem as well as your private cloud standpoint. And would you agree, Lloyd, in having one standardized? Obviously, there may be some differences from a technology standpoint, but having one formalized data governance program covering all of your data is quite critical, especially as we start moving data around to more places.
Yeah, absolutely. At least have the basics down. And I may touch on this in a later slide, but 3 classifications of data, keep it minimal. And if you understand your 3 classifications, whether it's public, private, sensitive, however you classify that, then that really helps understand how to structure that program. Okay, so talking about, again, your private cloud, you're hosting it internally or you're hosting it in another data center. You're all super excited. The business is geeked out. You're like, yes, I've got this private cloud. Let's do stuff with it. And IT needs to change their mindset a little bit to realize that they are now a service provider. IT's always been a service provider, but I think over time, as we've evolved our services, we kind of sometimes get a little disconnected from the fact that we're providing a service. And when it comes to cloud, you're no different than like an Amazon providing an S3 bucket, really, or whatever service you're providing. You need service levels. You need a simple set of orderables in your catalog. If you put 20 different virtual or private cloud services in your catalog, how's the business supposed to understand which one they're to order? The idea is to make this as flexible and as simple as possible for them. Some of your existing applications may be compatible. You could have somebody in the business say, hey, I've got this great app. It makes sense to me. Let's put it out into our private cloud. I need the elasticity. I need to be able to have it grow on demand and use resources and then scale it back down. Maybe that application doesn't work. If you've got your orchestration layer set up and you're trying to get it out there, it may just not work. So you need to take all those things into account. You also need to understand the shared responsibility. I think we mentioned about this before. You've got your different points there with data protection, regulatory, and legal, and all that kind of stuff. Patch configuration management. One of the goals is probably to contain the blast radius. So by having some of your private cloud farmed out to another service provider to handle some of that data center type infrastructure exclusively for your organization, think about that there may be benefits there to help shield you from any sort of breach where there's going to be a potential to cause a lot of damage once they get into the cloud. Anything you'd add to that one, Matt?
Yeah, I think when you look at this mindset of becoming a service provider, I think people, when you start advertising that you have this sort of capabilities internally, people, again, end users are always going to try to find what's the easiest route for them to get their job done. So I think having to have this mindset of being a service provider who can, like you mentioned, spin things up and down very rapidly and very simply is definitely part of how you have to have your private cloud set up, because people are, if you're not able to provide them with that same, speed and ease of use as the external cloud providers are, they're still going to find a way around your internal cloud and use these external cloud providers regardless, and kind of defeat the purpose of why you've done this in the first place.
Absolutely, and that goes to the predictable service delivery. The traditional downtimes associated with on-prem IT are probably not going to be as acceptable with a cloud-based service. I think there's at least enough common understanding out there now about what a cloud service is. So the business is probably going to be a little bit less acceptable of the traditional downtime type scenarios. As you do your private cloud, you should be able to accommodate for that, shifting your workloads through virtualization, having a solid change management program and incident management program in place, and making sure that as you do put things in your private cloud, there's that seamless transition out to public cloud services. And you might, as you're going through this, look at, wow, okay, I've got this application, but it doesn't really fit a private cloud service. This needs to go to public cloud. So you need to accommodate for that in your service delivery as well.
Absolutely.
All right, what's next? Okay, so yes, that gets to prioritizing to your business drivers. So you've got all that figured out, and now you need to figure out, okay, what are we going to actually deliver here in our private cloud services? So you've got a couple different options from my perspective. You're either going to be efficient or you're going to be agile, or a mix of the both. And when you're looking at efficiency, those are the ones where you want to reduce your capacity costs. They're commonly used services that are pretty straightforward. I think there's stateful and stateless. I think these would be the stateless ones, the ones that don't require redundant infrastructure, where you can shift through virtualization. That's where you're going to have pooled or shared resources. And we can get onto the topic of kind of the partitions or separating out, doing the multi-tenancy here in a minute. And you're also going to want to consider minimizing your agents and tools. Creating an efficient virtual private cloud isn't somewhere where you want to just go, well, we're not sure what you're going to do with it, so let's just put every single agent and tool imaginable on that. It's still a cloud service. Every single time the CPU sitting there spinning its cycles, you're paying for that. The business is paying for that. You need that clear cost transparency to them. And this helps you do that. And it also helps you optimize in the future. Conversely, if you're making, business decisions on research or you just need to adapt quickly to change, then you're going to want to have options available in your private cloud that are more agile, that can scale up and down very quickly, that aren't as tied to a change management or incident management process. You might want to have more tools and agents on these. This will be your more expensive option for the business because they're going to do things that don't fit that predictable mold that would underneath efficiency.
Yeah, and again, if we look at all of this, this really goes back to what we were talking about at first, and that is understanding what your needs are for having this private cloud. What are you going to be doing with it? Because it will start to determine some of these other situations and help you understand what your costs are going to be. Obviously, if you're going to have a more agile private cloud, that's probably going to have higher costs associated with it because of the tools and agents and the ability to move up and down and needing to actually have the ability to scale built in, right? So you might be sitting there with some resources not being used 90% of the time that only need to scale up for an end of month process or something along those lines. So planning and understanding your requirements really critical in all of this.
Absolutely. So that leads us into the process automation. Cloud is all about automation. It's just, you can't really do it without it. It's one of the aspects that makes cloud. So yeah, go ahead, go back to that slide.
Sorry?
No, you're good. So, you're going to want to automate your detection and response. You're going to want to minimize your human interactions with scaling up services. The business shouldn't have to email you and say, hey, next week, we're going to have to scale this up. We've got our big, open enrollment for insurance coming. And hey, we got a quick ramp. No, they should just do it automatically. And then when it breaks too, you want a predictable experience across the board, not just when it breaks, but in general. Is your cloud services scale, you get a infrastructure that fails, the business shouldn't notice that. They should have a predictable experience when they contact you and say, hey, look, I'm having a problem with this service. Something's not going right. You don't want to have them clunk through a whole bunch of bureaucracy that you may have internally, especially when it comes to on-prem systems and there's all these different owners and things like that. It's not a service delivery model I think you want to go for. Anything you'd add there, Matt?
Yeah, people will look at your private cloud the same as they do any other sort of cloud type service. So you have to really be able to be on par with what's available in a public cloud situation.
Absolutely. And that ties in with the self-service too. You're going to have to train and educate people. Well, private cloud can look a lot like a traditional on-prem service. It's not, because then you wouldn't be meeting the aspects of private cloud or the principles of the cloud in general. So you need to train and educate the business on when a private cloud option makes sense. It's just another arsenal in your toolkit for IS. It's one of the many options we have to be able to deliver a service to the business so they can do what it is they need to do. So they'll need to be aware of when it is appropriate to do that. You're going to need to have monitoring there, and you're going to need to have all that, like we mentioned, automation for provisioning and deprovisioning. They shouldn't have to go through a bunch of lengthy hoops or a bunch of forms on a service catalog to get this up and running. It should be as simple as going to like Amazon and getting an S3 bucket. It shouldn't be difficult. So,
absolutely.
All right, next slide. So invest in your orchestration as you're doing your provisioning and deprovisioning. This is like your fabric management. This is, managing your whole private cloud and everything inside of it. And that's where the stateful versus stateless comes into play. The stateful is going to be more expensive. You've got infrastructure redundancy you're going to have in place versus the stateless, which is typically more application based. You'd be able to shift those workloads through virtualization and be able to maintain that really high level of uptime. But not everything's going to be compatible with that. There's going to be things that you put in there. And Matt, I don't know if you have any examples on this one where it may not work with your fabric management. It may not work with your orchestration. So you've got to pay attention to that as you're looking at provisioning and deprovisioning.
I actually don't have any examples off the top.
Nope, that's okay. I'll be honest, in putting this together, I did not go through and try to find one that wouldn't necessarily be compatible. I think it's safe to say we're not engineers. I'm sure there are use cases out there. If you do have them, please send them our way. We'd love to talk about them. We'd love to look at them to understand where things might not work. But I think there's a way you can probably get most everything to work in a private cloud scenario. So
I can think of, especially in a manufacturing heavy area, that there may be some manufacturing apps that were written in someone's garage or written by some engineer, maybe some, some legacy or homegrown applications that you'd like to see put out in the cloud that might not be compatible. So I could certainly see some instances like that.
Yeah, I was hoping I could come with something specific, but that's exactly it. If you have applications, especially legacy ones, they may not like being shifted virtually in their workload to somewhere else. They may have infrastructure they rely on, and that's where the stateful comes in, where the application's resiliency is based upon stateful infrastructure and not just the stateless. So just keep that in mind. You can't just throw everything in there and lift and shift, if you will, out to your private cloud. And this is where I mentioned earlier about shared resource partitioning. When you're doing your resource pooling and you have your efficient private cloud set up for those models, for the services the business needs there, you got to think about, okay, your HR department wants to put a service in your shared private cloud, but you need to have the partitioning there. You need to have the tenant isolation, just like you would if you were a service provider. You've got to keep those things separate. They can't be in the same pool with everybody else. And you got to think about compliance and legal and regulatory in that regard as well. The bucket you're putting PHI in your private cloud probably isn't the one that you're going to want to put all of your public data, your general information in. So you need to make sure you have the tools there to do that partitioning.
Yeah, it goes right back to that data governance conversation again. But from a compliance standpoint, you have to know what's going where and who has access to it. And honestly, some auditing and monitoring around who is accessing that so that you're always fully aware of what's happening with this data.
Absolutely. And then two, you need to have some incentives. I've been trying to think about what some incentives could be today. I think it's safe to say that in traditional on-prem environments, you set it and forget it, if you will. So you turn the service on, you turn it up, you let the business have at it, you put a few business analysts on it and say, knock yourselves out, go for it. In the cloud model, public, private, or whatever, you got to pay attention to what resources are running. You need to understand when the utilization of resources occurs and then provide incentives for people to actually deprovision those, turn them off, stop them. Maybe it's a service that only needs to run 8 to 5. And by providing that clear cost transparency to the business, they can better understand when they turn those on and off. Now, getting people to change behavior, to change culture, to say, hey, at the end of the day, when you're done with this application that's running on this server, turn your server off. I think that's kind of a foreign concept to people, to turn a server off, right? Those should be on all the time. But when it comes to cloud services, that can get very expensive quickly sitting there idle. So come up with some sort of program for stewardship, good stewardship of those corporate resources.
Yes, especially if you have a lot of development. I know a lot of development happens inside of private clouds, and
Mhm.
those honestly probably only need to be up and running while that development and testing is happening and not being run outside of that. The icon there, I believe, is Bitcoin. Money might work, but I think you can also just put some things in place. I mean, if nothing else, maybe there's some sort of communication or congratulations or something that goes out from to those teams that are involved there, of just saying that you appreciate the fact that they're doing it. Or you can, I'm sure you can figure out some costs associated with having them turned off versus left running all the time, and actually communicate this out. Hey, if we leave all these machines running, it's costing us X number of dollars that we can't use for other things. And I think sometimes, just a communication piece will help. If not, then Bitcoin.
Yeah, yeah, the Bitcoin. Yeah, I couldn't think of a better icon to put there. But just like Microsoft, if you're a smaller business, you'll get those billing. And Matt, we were just talking about that. Those billing notices and those change notices and things like that. You need to provide that same service to your business so they can see the impact of leaving it running. And I would say maybe not go with a negative-based incentive approach. Go with something positive and just say, "Hey, look, here's how much you're spending, and just thought you should know. And hey, maybe you could save some money if you turn this off." They're paying for it. In an ideal scenario, not IT. They're paying for those services. So they're responsible, and you need to help them with that responsibility.
Start with the positive, and if that doesn't work, you may
Yes,
eventually have to go with the negative, just because it's money that is truly being wasted.
absolutely.
I think you could actually argue that same thing for your public cloud, that you should have some sort of understanding of what, anything that you have that's in any cloud of, does it need to be running all the time? And if not, shut it off, because you're spending money for nothing otherwise.
Absolutely.
So this next part we wanted to talk about is around identity management. And so, as you start to shift, and again, this could be related to public and private cloud, but as identities start to move off-prem, or at least become more virtualized, I think it's even more important to understand and have good processes built around identity management. Much like data starting to go everywhere, as you begin to put more things in the cloud, you're going to start to have identities in more places. And so when we talked about some of the areas that we thought were important, certainly onboarding and offboarding, I've been preaching this for a long time. But I think in terms of having things in a private cloud, important to have this integration with your on-prem. You don't want your public cloud to become an administrative nightmare for your help desk and Active Directory admins, where they're having to create accounts in multiple different places. Because on the flip side of all of that work is the security hole of having to offboard people in multiple places. So you should most definitely have workflows and some automation built in, not just for the creation, but equally as important for the termination. So if someone does leave the company, that they have completely lost access to anything that they had access to. I've heard lots and lots of horror stories over the years of people, quitting a company, but still having access to some application, or, of even things like Salesforce and other things that they still have access to that are cloud-based, that, gosh, you really don't want a former employee having access to.
And you can really think about that to that point, like just with a basic Microsoft service like SharePoint. If you're using that internally, you're probably aware that you can invite guests, you can bring them into your tenant. And as you're collaborating with external organizations, particularly if you've brought cloud on the ground, where you kind of wall off the cloud service, you end up with all these guest accounts and things inside of your tenant that when you need to offboard somebody, they can get orphaned. There's no owner. You're not sure who this guest is, who's responsible for that. So again, like you said, Matt, this applies both private and public. And even as something as simple as that can become a real headache if you don't have solid identity management processes that are all tied together and not creating, a account for this cloud service, an account for that cloud service, even within your own virtual private cloud. As you partition things and isolate things off from others, you don't want to have different
Yeah,
identities for those.
And if you think again about what are some of the main uses for private cloud, and you think of development boxes and maybe some service boxes, and so maybe you don't even have permanent employees that are logging into these things. These are temporary accounts, or temp, or contracted workers that might only be in for a short amount of time. There is a potential for a lot of churn to happen from an onboarding offboarding standpoint as you start to move some of the stuff to the cloud, making all of this even more critical.
Yeah, and if you part of your disaster recovery plan is to leverage the capabilities of a private cloud for to just have everything replicated out there. Let's say you want to implement your private cloud. You've decided the definition of your private cloud is business recovery. So you take an exact model of your data center, build it out into this private cloud, and if something happens, you can just flip the switch and it goes over. If you don't have solid identity management, that could be pretty chaotic. I think you can
Absolutely,
some headaches. So yeah, get this one down. Talk to Matt. He'll help you out.
I'll do my best. I'll get back on my 20 plus years soapbox. Yeah, so some of the other stuff we have here, again, be service oriented. You should be looking at any sort of shared components that your IT organization has when you're moving into a SaaS type situation. Pay attention to the stuff that you have on-prem and not just off-prem or up in your cloud, right? Understand that the stuff that you're putting out there still probably needs to work with things that you have on-prem. And so understanding how to make those connections, much like you have integration to your on-prem directories, you should probably, again, make sure that there's some seamless connections to other things that you have on-prem. Lloyd, on the loosely coupled one there, what do you want to add to that one?
So yeah, I think what we're getting at there with the loosely coupled terminology, and we did borrow this from another site that we found that seemed to have some pretty solid concepts around identity management.
Yeah, that link down there is actually pretty good if anyone wants to go to it. So thank you to IDMWorks for that.
Yeah, for sure. When you're building your private cloud, I think what we're saying here is that leverage the other services that you already have. So maybe there's a platform service that you currently have that you can bring in and you can use. So you're not, I think what we're trying to say is don't build everything inside of one basket. You can leverage other services you already have. Don't make it so tightly integrated to that one instance that you're hosting in your private cloud that you can't connect it elsewhere. I really think that's what this one is getting at.
Yeah. I think what we're leaning towards here is the fact that at some point you will probably have to look at a bit of a hybrid. Maybe it makes sense to move things from your on-prem into your private cloud, but maybe you've already made investments in something that's in a public cloud, and you might not need to move that into your private cloud. It might be cheaper and working just fine where it's at. So just making sure that all of these different things are able to talk to each other, that you have your onboarding, offboarding done and all of this, always coupled with the identity management is the data management piece. So just understand that as you're looking out over your larger landscape that your organization has of making sure that you have this stuff working together.
And I think that brings us to our last slide here, which has a lot of words on it. And that's just like with everything else we do in IT, build your security in at the beginning, bake in all the requirements as much as you can. It does become a challenge, as we know, with regulatory and what you need to be compliant to. And that's, again, we're having great data governance programs in place so that the business understands what their regulatory requirements are would be beneficial. But I think at least on a high level, from a security perspective, one of the challenges I get constantly is the business coming to me and saying, give me my requirements. And I always have to come back and say, but I don't know what you're doing, and I don't know what you need to be compliant to or what your regulatory obligations are. Well, we just want to have this service. So I started thinking around, okay, how could we do this to at least get some sort of basic built-in security up front, especially on like a private cloud or a cloud service. And I think the important point to take away here is that if you have internal or external resources like vendors, coming in and doing things inside of your perimeter, and you're offering this private cloud service, if they can order a virtual machine in that service through your catalog, they have access to that catalog, you just gave them authenticated and authorized access to your network and data. That means they spun up a virtual machine, they have an account, they can connect it to the internet, and guess what? If you've defined your private cloud that it's going to be able to access internal services, they're on the inside. You may want to think about how you're doing your service catalog and how virtual machines are ordered today, if you're not already looking at that. But then, you start building in other requirements, like you need to have your automation kicked in there, making sure that things are going least privileged, you're using role-based access, and your encryption keys, don't store them with your private cloud, especially if you're having another data center host it. Make sure that that organization doesn't have your key to be able to just look at everything you're doing. If they get breached, I mean, it's a nightmare. Don't do that. Figure out your monitoring, alerting, and response. You've kind of got, from my perspective, 3 buckets you can build to: your public, your internal or private data, and then your sensitive, like your regulated data, if we can use those kind of terms to define those 3 classifications of data. And you can kind of build to that. So when you build your monitoring and alerting, think about those 3 categories and what you need on each one of those, and then create a baseline. Don't just turn on all your auditing and alerting. As we know, it's just going to be noise. The volume's going to be loud. You need to figure out what you need, what's actually important to you. And by aligning to those classifications, that at least gives you a target that you can go towards as you baseline each one of those and create your monitoring and alerting rules. And make sure that your endpoints, your tools are fitting to the service. So if somebody orders a public type cloud service within your private cloud, you probably don't need to have every single thing looked at and logged and paid attention to. You still need to do it, but maybe that's not what you're going to alert on, because they're just using public data. And if it got out of your organization, what damage is that really going to do? Like what is the actual impact to the business here? So keep that in mind. Also, taking a zero application trust approach. IT isn't in control of what's running on these servers anymore. You are a service provider. You are providing a service, and the business can install anything they want to them. So going back to the APIs, going back to the fact that private cloud isn't, quote, private, that the business can do things in there that could really, really make problems for you. So pay attention to that. I would say build it to not trust anything running in that environment. Anything there you'd add, Matt, before we get in the last?
No, I certainly agree. I think you have to understand, like you just said, that your private cloud isn't necessarily private. In some ways, you're giving your end users, your developers, your app owners more power than maybe they had before when things were on-prem. So I'm full favor of not trusting anything that's going on out there. Again, this all goes back to those planning stages, though, understanding what it is that you're going to allow in your private cloud, understand what the business drivers are, understand the costs associated with it, and obviously understand the security risks associated with all of this. Because as you move to the next one, they're just talking again about, legal and risk. The last thing you want to do is build out this big, beautiful private cloud, put the wrong data up there, don't have it secured, and now your organization is in some sort of a legal battle because somebody put the wrong data out there and you didn't have any controls around it. A career limiting move, probably, in a lot of ways. So again, while there's tremendous amount of power and flexibility with doing a private cloud, you really truly have to understand the security wrapped around it.
Yeah, definitely. And 2 is your business users are rapidly provisioning and deprovisioning services. You got to think about your litigation holds, your retention, especially if it's regulated data. If a developer spins up a server for 2 hours, copies a bunch of prod data, and it tears it down, do you know what they did there? Do you know what data they sent out? So you got to think about those aspects too. And then same thing we talked about before, multi-tenancy, confidentiality, sensitive information, they need to be isolated inside your private cloud. So make sure you're planning for that as well. And And then with your threat modeling, only enable the services required at the service level. Don't leave, if you're doing desktop as a service, let's say you just want to provide desktops as a service in your private cloud, maybe you want to do that. Don't run every single service imaginable. Just turn off everything except for what you need. You should be able to get some idea of, based on what the business wants to do with that. And then limiting your data routing. So if you create a 3-tiered application stack within your private cloud, you shouldn't have to route that out and then route it back in for those applications to be able to talk to each other. So you need to be able to accommodate in your design of your private cloud for those application stacks to be able to talk without going through a broker. I think it exposed some additional risk and vulnerabilities there if you do so.
One of the final things that I will add here when we talk about all of this security, test it. Much in the way that we do things like tabletop exercises and other, other security tests in the real world, penetration tests and other things. You need to be doing the same sort of validation that your security that you have in your private cloud is as good as in your public cloud, is as good as in your on-prem. Again, just because it says private doesn't mean that it's private, doesn't mean that it's safe, doesn't mean that it's secure. It's going to be as private, safe, and secure as you make it. But if you're not testing all of these things that you've put in place and knowing that it's that way, it might not be.
Absolutely. Yeah, my final thoughts here, if nothing else, take away the fact that you do need to define that private cloud, like Matt mentioned. You need to understand what the business wants to do with it and where it's going with it. Make sure you at least have some sort of thoughts around data governance, and to understand that people can put whatever they want there and connect it to other services if you've decided to allow that. And if they haven't, they're probably going to find a way to do it. So there we go. That's private cloud.
That's private cloud. Thanks again for everyone for watching. Please subscribe and like and all the stuff the cool kids do. Leave us some feedback. We're certainly happy to hear if these things have value to those of you that are watching. If anybody would like to be a part of one, if there's a topic that you are familiar with that you would like to do something like this for our YouTube channel, we are certainly more than happy to have other people get involved here as well.
Absolutely. Looking forward to hearing from you, and we'll talk to you in episode 3.